She took a bite, and the world changed. A girl with skin like snow and lips like blood falls lifeless to the ground. A crimson apple rolls from her hand, still shining in the light. We call it a fairy tale, but this image, the innocent girl, the poisoned fruit, the silent fall, has haunted us for over 3,000 years. The apple was never just an apple. It was never just about beauty or jealousy or love. It was about punishment, about knowledge, about the fear of what women might do if they weren't afraid. So what are we really remembering when we tell this story to children? Where did the poisoned apple come from? And why does it keep returning again and again in myths, scriptures, and dreams? She was the fairest of them all. That's how the story always begins. A girl with hair black as night, skin pale as snow, and lips red as blood. A queen's needle pricks her finger, and a single drop of crimson falls onto white fabric. That drop becomes a wish. The wish becomes a child, and the child becomes a threat. When her mother dies, a new queen takes her place, cold, vain, and vengeful. Every morning she stares into a mirror and demands assurance, am I still the most beautiful? And for a time the mirror says yes. But then Snow White grows up, and one day the mirror answers differently. Jealousy is a quiet thing at first, a glance too long, a sentence unvandouilled, but jealousy ripens quickly. It ferments, it curdles, and in the queen's case it becomes a command. Take her to the forest, kill her, bring me her heart in a box. The huntsman fails, the girl escapes. She flees into the forest and finds shelter with 7 dwarves. They warn her, don't open the door for strangers. But evil doesn't knock loudly. It comes dressed in ribbons and kindness, and sometimes it looks like a simple apple. The queen tries many tricks, a corset pulled too tight, a poisoned comb, but nothing works until the apple, red on one side, white on the other. Beauty and death held in perfect balance. She hands it to the girl with a smile. Snow White bites it and drops dead. Or so it seems. A glass coffin is built. Time passes. The world forgets. Until one day a prince arrives. Depending on the version, he either kisses her or shakes the coffin or simply removes the apple from her throat. In any case, she awakens, and they live happily ever after, or so the story says, but fairy tales are not about happy endings. Not really. They're about warnings, they're about fear, and most of all, they're about memory. Because this is not the only story where a beautiful woman is punished for being seen, not the only tale where a bite of fruit leads to silence, to sleep, to death. It's easy to think of Snow White as fiction, a sweet bedtime story wrapped in ribbons and rhyme. But if you peel back the layers, if you ask where the apple came from, why it's always red, why it always appears in the hands of a woman, you begin to see a pattern, and patterns are never accidental. That's the door we're about to open, because the poisoned apple didn't begin with Snow White, and it didn't end there either. Let's clear one thing up. In the original Grimm version of Snow White, the apple isn't just poisoned, it's split. Half red, half white, one side beautiful, one side deadly. And Snow White, trusting, takes the red half, the side meant to lure her. She bites, she falls, and the apple, like a truth too sharp to swallow, stays lodged in her throat. That's not a coincidence. That's not decoration. That's a symbol. Because the apple in fairy tales was never meant to be a snack. It was a message. And it didn't begin with the Grimms. In fact, the word apple has long been used in Western languages as a placeholder for any forbidden fruit. In Latin, the word malum meant both apple and evil. The dual meaning was poetic and intentional. So when artists in the Middle Ages painted Eve holding a fruit, they chose an apple. Not because the Bible said so, it didn't, but because it felt right. Because apples, by then, had become loaded with meaning, knowledge, temptation, terror, danger, beauty, betrayal. A fruit that glowed with life on the outside, but hid rot underneath. And that's the thing about apples. They don't just feed, they seduce. They are symmetrical, glossy, sweet-smelling, easy to hold in one hand. A perfect delivery system for anything. For poison, for shirts, for sin. Across cultures, apples appear not as food, but as offerings, as tools, as tests. In Slavic folklore, golden apples are guarded by dragons and given only to the worthy. In Irish legend, magical apples grow on trees in the otherworld, where time flows differently and no mortal can stay. In Persian myth, apples are gifts from divine beings, linked to healing and power, but also to death. and in Norse myth, the apples of Idun are what keep the gods from aging. Without them, they crumble. So when a woman hands a stranger an apple in a story, it's never casual. It's an invitation, a transaction, a silent contract sealed in fruit. The queen offers the apple, the girl accepts, and something ancient is replayed again. We tend to treat these stories as isolated fairy tales, but the truth is, they're echoes. Faint repetitions of something much older. Older than books, older than castles, older than memory. Because the apple didn't start as poison, it became poison. And to understand why, we have to go back, far back, to a different garden, a different woman, and a fruit whose price was everything. It begins in a garden. Not a fairy tale forest, not a poisoned castle, but a paradise, the Garden of Eden, a place without pain, without shame, without knowledge. In the centre of that garden stood 2 trees. One gave eternal life. The other, the one they weren't allowed to touch, gave something else. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Not just information, but awareness, consciousness, the ability to see the world and see yourself in it. According to Genesis, God told Adam and Eve they could eat from any tree, except that one rule, one fruit, one command. But then comes the serpent, sly, subtle, soft-spoken. He asks a question that still echoes. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree? And with that the door opens. Eve looks at the fruit. It's pleasing to the eye, desirable for gaining wisdom. She bites. Then she gives it to Adam. He bites too. And suddenly, everything changes. They see they're naked. They feel shame. They hide. For the first time in the Bible, humans are afraid. What kind of fruit was it? The text never says. It could have been a fig, a pomegranate, a date. But centuries later, artists in Europe chose something else. They painted Eve holding an apple. Why? Because apples, by that time, symbolized temptation. Because they were easy to paint. Because, in Latin, malus meant both apple and evil. Because it made sense. And slowly, in our cultural memory, the fruit of knowledge became an apple. But here's the twist. The tree wasn't cursed. The fruit wasn't deadly. It was forbidden. The danger wasn't what it did to the body. It was what it awakened in the mind. It wasn't about hunger. It was about choice. To bite that fruit was to disobey, to see yourself, to know, to become more than what you were made to be. And that's why the punishment was so harsh. Eve was cursed with pain in childbirth. Adam, with toil and sweat. They were exiled, pushed out of the garden and into the world. And yet, it was the beginning of humanity as we know it. Awareness, morality, struggle, all of it began with a bite. That's the paradox. The apple brought death, but also consciousness. It caused exile, but created identity. And Eve, often painted as weak, naive, easily swayed, was the one who made the first choice. In that sense, she's not the villain. She's the first rebel, the first seeker of truth, the one who looked at paradise and said, there must be more. The poisoned apple in Snow White is often seen as punishment for vanity. But the forbidden fruit in Eden, that was the price of awareness. And perhaps it's the same fruit, one hidden in myth, the other in scripture, both offered by a woman, both bringing transformation, both wrapped in sweetness and laced with consequence. So when we see an apple in a story, we should ask, is this nourishment, or is this knowledge, and are we ready for the cost? Not all apples are red, and not all poison kills the body. Some apples kill empires. In Greek mythology, the gods are feasting. All of them invited. All except one, Eris, the goddess of discord. The one no one wants at the table. She doesn't scream, she doesn't curse, she does something quieter, smarter. She crafts a gift, a golden apple. On its shining skin she carves 3 words, "To the fairest." And she tosses it onto the banquet table, like a spark into dry grass. 3 goddesses reach for it at once. Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom, Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, all divine, all powerful, all unwilling to share. They turn to Zeus. He refuses to choose, so they find someone else, a mortal prince named Paris of Troy. Each goddess offers him a bribe. Hera promises power, Athena offers victory in war, Aphrodite whispers of a woman named Helen, the most beautiful in the world. Paris chooses beauty. He gives the apple to Aphrodite. And with that, The world cracks open. Helen is stolen from her husband, armies rise, Troy burns, all because of a fruit that wasn't poisonous, but was more dangerous than any blade. Because what Eris understood is this: you don't need to strike the body to destroy a kingdom, you only need to touch the ego. The golden apple became a symbol of temptation, pride, and the wars we start for beauty, for power, for a name. And it didn't end with Eris. In Roman art, Venus holds an apple, proof of her divine win. In Renaissance paintings, the apple shows up again, this time in the hands of Eve, and then later in the hands of a jealous queen offered to a sleeping girl. The fruit keeps shifting, changing colour, changing meaning, but it always carries the same question: who deserves it? To the fairest, to the purest, to the most obedient, to the one who doesn't know the cost. We're taught to chase the apple, to crave it, to define ourselves by whether we receive it or not. But here's the darker truth. The apple isn't a prize, it's bait. In every story, the one who takes it pays a price. Helen loses her home, Paris loses his life, Snow White loses her breath, Eve loses paradise. And none of them knew, when they reached out their hands, that they were stepping into history. So when we speak of the poisoned apple, we're not just talking about fairy tales. We're talking about the soft gleam of temptation, the promise of being chosen, and the cost of believing that beauty is a gift freely given. Because the truth is, nothing golden is ever given. It's always thrown, and always at a cost. In the myths of the North, even gods grow old. They are strong, yes, fierce in battle, masters of magic and fate, but not immortal, not by default. They age unless they eat the fruit. Not just any fruit. Golden, sacred, hidden. In Norse mythology, there is a goddess named Idun. She does not wield a sword. She does not command storms or shape fate. She carries a box, and inside it, apples. Apples that shimmer with light. Apples that smell like spring after long winter. Apples that hold time in their skin. Idun's fruit is what keeps the gods young. Without her, Thor's strength withers, Odin's eye clouds, Freya's beauty fades, and one day she's taken. The story begins with Loki. Of course it does. The trickster, the shapeshifter, the one who stirs chaos with a smile. He makes a deal with a giant, as he often does. In exchange for peace, he promises something dangerous. He promises Idun. Loki tricks her, leads her into the forest. And there, the giant snatches her away, carries her off into the mountains, seals her inside a cave, and the gods begin to age. Their hands tremble, their faces wrinkle, their powers fade. Without the apples, they are no different from mortals. Stripped of their eternity, they remember fear. They threaten Loki. They demand her return, and once again, he shifts shape, this time into a falcon, and flies to rescue her. She escapes as a nut clutched in his talons. But the truth remains. Even gods are bound by time, and even eternity depends on fruit. Why apples? Why always apples? Because they're small enough to hold, yet powerful enough to undo fate. Because they're round, like the sun, like cycles, like death and return, and because to eat one is to take in more than flesh. It's to ingest memory, magic, transformation. In Idun's case, the apple is not punishment, it's preservation. A thread that holds together a world always on the edge of falling apart, but when it's stolen, everything begins to decay. That's the core of the myth. Youth is fragile, power can be taken, and what sustains us can vanish in the blink of a lie. We don't often think of apples as sacred anymore. They sit in lunchboxes, on supermarket shelves, in children's stories, but once they were divine, they were guarded, fought over, whispered about, and when removed from the hands of their keeper, chaos followed. Just like Snow White, just like Eve, just like Helen, the apple is not just a fruit, it's a container, for time, for fate, for everything we can lose, and when someone else holds it, we wither. There was a time when fruit meant life. In ancient myths, apples restored youth. They were gifts from gods, sacred. But something changed. By the time we reach the Middle Ages, the fruit has rotted. Not in form, still red, still round, still shining, but in meaning. The apple becomes a trap, a trick, a lie in the shape of a gift. In medieval Europe, the apple began to appear in new hands, not those of goddesses or divine messengers, but in the hands of women accused of witchcraft. She wasn't glowing anymore. She was hunched, alone, eyes like smoke, and she wasn't offering wisdom. She was offering death. One bite. That was all it took. The shift wasn't accidental. By the 13th century, Christian Europe had begun to recast the world into binaries. Heaven and hell. Holy and heretic, pure and unclean, man and woman. And the apple, once a symbol of divine favour, was absorbed into a darker system of belief. The woman who offered it was now dangerous, the girl who received it, foolish, and the fruit itself, it was no longer golden, it was red, blood red, the colour of sin. It's in this cultural fog that Snow White takes shape. She's no longer Eve, she's no longer Idun, she is innocent, but punished. Beautiful, but violent. Awake, but powerless. The queen who offers the apple is no longer a goddess of beauty or a bringer of change. She's a witch, a stepmother, a threat, and she doesn't offer knowledge, she offers silence. Because what happens after Snow White bites the apple? She doesn't speak, she doesn't cry, she simply falls into a glass coffin, into stillness, into legend. In medieval iconography, Eve and the Virgin Mary were often juxtaposed. Eve held the apple, temptation. Mary held Jesus, redemption. But between them stood silence, a long, echoing silence around the voices of women. So many tales from this period end the same way. The woman speaks, she suffers, she is winced, a bite, a fall, a coffin. It's not just about the fruit. It's about the fear of what fruit can represent. Temptation, choice, power. And most of all, transformation. Because when you eat something, you take it inside you. You change, you become something new. That's why the apple had to be poisoned. It had to be a warning, not a door, but a wall. A message wrapped in sweetness. Don't bite, don't ask, don't seek, just sleep. And yet, the story keeps being told, not to forget the danger, but because somewhere deep inside we still remember what the apple once meant. Not death, but awakening. Not silence, but voice. Not poison, but the beginning of something real. She bites the fruit. And she pays the price. That's the pattern. Across cultures, across centuries, the one who dares to taste, to ask, to want more, is almost always a woman. Eve, who reaches for wisdom and is cast out. Persephone, who eats the seeds of the underworld and loses the light. Snow White, who accepts the red half and falls into silence. Different names, different places, same punishment, man. Because in myth, when a man seeks knowledge, he becomes a hero. Prometheus steals fire. He is chained but remembered as brave. Odysseus outwits gods. He is praised for cunning. Solomon names demons. He is called wise. But when a woman seeks truth, she is cursed. She is blamed. She is erased. Why? Because knowledge is power. And for much of human history, power was not meant to be shared, especially not with her. Throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, women who spoke too much, read too deeply, or asked too many questions were labelled dangerous. They were called witches, temptresses, serpents in disguise. Not because they were evil, but because they were awake. To know was to see was to question, and to question was to threaten the order of things. So the stories taught us early, if a woman wants something, punish her. If she opens the door, curse her, sure. If she tastes the fruit, make her fall. This wasn't just narrative, it was doctrine, written into sermons, painted into church walls, whispers in nursery rhymes. Even the fairy tale itself was weaponized. Snow White was a lesson. A girl must be obedient. She must be quiet. She must wait for rescue, not seek it. And if she forgets, the fruit will remind her. But buried underneath that warning, there's something older. A trace of an older story, a different ending. What if Eve wasn't a sinner but a seeker? What if Snow White's fall wasn't punishment but initiation? What if the fruit wasn't poison, but passage? In ancient mystery cults, to consume the sacred fruit was to cross a threshold, to die a symbolic death, to awaken to truth, to be reborn, but over time that idea was reversed. The fruit was still a doorway, but now it only led to shame. We see this everywhere. Lilith, Adam's first wife in Jewish folklore, was said to refuse obedience. She was cast out. Pandora, curious and bright, opened a box of secrets. She unleashed suffering. The woman who knows must be punished. The girl who seeks must be silenced. And so we keep telling the story, not because it's sweet, but because it's familiar, because deep down we still live in its shadow. We teach our daughters to be good, to be still, to never reach for more than what they're given. But some stories refuse to stay quiet. They rise again, each time a woman asks why, each time she bites back. And maybe that's what the poisoned apple really is, not a weapon, but a memory of the moment a girl said yes to hunger, to vision, to power, and everything changed. Not all poison is meant to kill, some is meant to change you. In the old world, the line between witch and healer was paper thin. The woman who mixed herbs could cure or curse. The man who studied transformation could turn lead to gold or soul to fire. They were feared, not because they were wrong, but because they knew too much. Alchemy was never just about turning metals, that was the surface. What it truly aimed to transmute was the self. The apple in this world becomes more than a symbol, it becomes a tool, a vessel. The red skin is not just temptation, it is fire, it is blood, it is heat made visible, and the poison inside, it is not meant to end life, it is meant to burn away what you were, so that something else might rise in its place. Witches knew this. The ancient herb women who lived at the edges of forests, grinding roots in bowls made of bone. The midwives who whispered names before the child took its first breath. The ones who were hunted, not because they harmed, but because they remembered. Remembered the old songs, the old tongues, the old knowledge buried under centuries of fear. They knew what the apple meant, not sin, but shift, not death, but passage. That's why the church feared them, because they offered transformation not through prayer, but through taste. One bite, and nothing would ever be the same. The alchemists, many of them men, were allowed to go further. They hid behind symbols. They called their poisons elixirs, their deaths purifications. They carved apples into lead, painted red fruit on scrolls of gold, said that the apple was the philosopher's stone in disguise, the fruit that, when properly understood, could shatter the veil between body and soul. And always there was the red. Red as mercury, red as blood, red as the moment before transformation. Even in Snow White's tale, the apple is not just red, it is split, white and red, innocence and danger, the two sides of the human self, the child and the alchemist. Snow White's sleep isn't just death, it's chrysalis. She eats, she falls, she waits, and when she rises, she is no longer a girl. She is queen, but we don't tell it that way. We say she was saved, by a kiss, by a man, by something soft. We erase the fire, we erase the poison, we erase the truth, that maybe the apple wasn't given to destroy her. Maybe it was given to unlock her, because every transformation needs a catalyst, and every soul has a center, something red, something buried, something burning. And maybe the poison isn't the fruit. Maybe the poison is forgetting who we were before we were told to be afraid. We've been telling the same story for over 3,000 years. A fruit, a bite, a fall. It changes names, it changes languages, but it never really disappears. In Mesopotamian myth, Inanna descends into the underworld, seeking wisdom. She passes through 7 gates, surrenders her power, and is hung on a hook, dead. But when she returns, she holds fruit from a tree that grew beside her tomb. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero dives to the bottom of the ocean to retrieve a sacred plant that grants eternal life. He brings it back, only to have it stolen by a serpent. Gone, swallowed, like a truth we weren't meant to hold for long. In Chinese mythology, the Queen Mother of the West keeps the peaches of immortality in her garden. They ripen once every 3,000 years. Gods are invited to taste them, mortals are not. And if they do, they are transformed or destroyed. In Hindu cosmology, the Kalpavriksha, the wish-fulfilling tree, offers fruit that can bring anything the soul desires, but desire always carries a price. Again and again, across cultures, the act is the same, the reaching hand, the forbidden fruit, the irreversible change. It doesn't matter if it's an apple, a peach, a pomegranate, or a golden branch. What matters is the choice, the hunger, the aftermath. We keep swallowing this story, feeding it to our children, wrapping it in rhyme, softening its edges, but the core remains. And what if it's not just a story? What if this isn't about fruit at all? What if it's about memory? A memory buried deep in the human mind, of a time when knowledge was punished, when women were feared, when transformation was forbidden. What if these tales aren't cautionary at all, but confessional? Whispers passed down through firelight and lullabies, reminders of something we saw once, long ago, and weren't allowed to speak of again, not directly. So we spoke in symbols. We made the truth small enough to hold, sweet enough to swallow, red enough to forget, but stories remember, even when we forget ourselves. And the poisoned apple? It's just one name, for one fruit, of one tree, a tree that still stands, somewhere behind the veil, rooted in memory, watered by myth, waiting to bear fruit again. A girl, a hand, a bite. It happens quietly, it always does, but something loud echoes beneath it, a sound older than language, older than fear. For thousands of years we've told stories about sacred fruit. Sometimes it gives life, sometimes it gives death, but it never leaves you unchanged. We treat the apple like an object, like a plot device, something pretty, something portable, something poisoned. But maybe that was never the point. Maybe the fruit was never meant to feed the body. Maybe it was meant to crack it open, like a seed, like a soul, because eating is intimacy. To take something inside yourself, to let it shape you. That's not consumption, that's transformation. And transformation has always been dangerous, especially for the ones not meant to change. The girl who bites the fruit becomes something new, and for that, we call her cursed. We put her in a coffin of glass. We wait for someone to come fix her, but maybe she never needed saving. Maybe she needed time to digest, to dream, to return. We say she was asleep, but I don't think so. I think she was remembering. That's my opinion at least. And I say it not as a scholar, not as a theologian, but as someone who has looked into old stories long enough to see the pulse still moving beneath them. These tales don't survive because they're charming. They survive because they carry something we're not ready to say aloud. That there's a cost to waking up. That knowledge is painful. That beauty has teeth. And that sometimes the truth is wrapped in red skin and handed to you with a smile. I don't think the poisoned apple was ever meant to be a warning. I think it was an invitation to bite, to fall, to see what happens next. And maybe that's why we keep telling this story. Not because we fear the fruit, but because deep down we still want to taste it.